natural resources are used as political asset for many regimes in terms of political survival.
It's a bad idea to think that the other should come to fund our development. I think that's wrong. They will come invest for their interest.
Africa holds an estimated 30% of the world's critical minerals. Cobalt, copper, lithium, the building blocks of the green energy transition. And as global powers race to secure supply chains, the continent finds itself at the center of a familiar tension between extraction and development, between outside investment and local benefit. From the cobalt mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo to major infrastructure projects like the Lobito Corridor, billions of dollars are flowing in. But the question remains, who actually gains?
The basic guardrail to avoid that scramble to take place is just to have, first of all, political stability and basic good governance in many of those countries.
How are geopolitics reshaping the competition for Africa's minerals? What safeguards exists or don't for the communities living with the social and environmental costs of extraction?
But there will not be energy transition if we don't take care of people who are really depending on those minerals.
And can this movement be different from the extractive patterns of the past?
We have the African mining vision. I don't know any African country who has negotiated its mining deals with any partners having the AMV in mind.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, critical minerals, critical choices. Africa's role in the transitioning world. Today, we're joined by Emmanuel Mpula and Gerald Nima. Emmanuel Mpula is Executive Director of the African Natural Resources Watch and an expert on business and human rights in the extractive sector. Gerald Nima is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Africa Program and Africa editor at the China Global South Project, focusing on China's engagement in African mining. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
So I'm going to start with you, Gerald, on a little bit of context. So we're seeing our countries around the world are really turning to Africa for critical minerals and major infrastructure partnerships. So if you could just set the scene for us, which countries are currently central to this supply chain and which global actors are really most actively helping to shape the scale and direction of investment flowing into Africa's green mineral supply chains?
Thank you, Courtney, for having us in this conversation and for your question. I cannot start answering this question without mentioning the DRC, of course, given the news cycle that's taking place against the backdrop of the US-DRC partnership agreement that was signed last week. So the DRC is one of these countries where you do have a concentration of those minerals, especially when you talk about copper and cobalt being two of the main minerals that are in the conversation of critical minerals. But the DRC is not alone in that conversation. You have countries like Mali, producers of gold, but also lithium. You have countries like Guinea, where you have iron ore, bauxite, which is now in very important minerals. You also have countries like South Africa, home for a large portion of the world's largest reserve of PGMs metal in the world. You have countries like Zimbabwe with lithium. You have Namibia with nickel, with lithium as well. You have Tanzania to a certain extent with rare earth minerals. So you have a good amount of African countries that are now part of the conversation of critical minerals on the continent. But of course, not all of them are world producers, because in that space, given the rush and the interest because of the geopolitical tension around critical minerals, every country that has just a bit of share of any kind of those minerals would like to present itself as, a very important country. But the reality is, when you look in terms of like world shares production, not a lot of them are really world producers. So in that space of world producer, we're gonna name country like Guinea with bauxite and iron ore, DRC with copper and cobalt, South Africa with PGMs, South Africa and Zimbabwe with lithium. We can, to a certain extent, as I say, mention Tanzania with rare earth as among the largest producer in Africa, but in terms of the world, still not a big producer when you have a country like China being part of that conversation. So you have those countries that are really part of the debate in terms of critical minerals in Africa. But now, in terms of external partners, of course, you have China being present in Guinea, in DRC, in Tanzania with the Chenga resources, where we saw a very interesting move of Australian companies selling their asset to Chinese mining company. It's the same thing that we saw in Zimbabwe, by the way. One of the interesting points about having China dominating the lithium industry in Zimbabwe was the fact that many of those mines belong to Australians, where they sold the mining rights to Chinese. That was really a very interesting move to see and to observe over the years. So yes, China is the main stakeholders in many of those countries, but China is not alone. When you go to Zambia, you have Canadian company, you have other cobalt also in American companies trying to take root in that space in Zambia as well. So you also have Glencore, Swiss company in the DRC, which also very present. You have ERG from Kazakhstan, some important mines of cobalt and copper in the DRC. So the landscape is quite varied. It's very various landscape, but China overall would be the main stakeholders in that space on the continent.
And how, just as a quick follow-up, how is China's involvement shaping the way that the extractive industry is working? Or are you just seeing differences based on the type of minerals that are being mined? How does it vary from country to country in terms of the approaches that you're seeing?
Of course, we have some commonalities, some common trends that we see across Chinese mining projects on the continent. One of the common point that we see, which is quite sad, is the point of pollution and ESG standard violation that we see in DRC. We saw that in Namibia, we saw that in Zimbabwe, we saw them in Zambia recently as well. We have all those kind of complaints being part of Chinese investment in that space on the continent. But the element that I'd like also to point out is the fact that we have to take into account the fact that they are operating in jurisdictions which have a very bad reputation in terms of governance, in terms of law regulation, which also really kind of creates a compounding context that would explain why certain mining company would be behaving that way. But when it comes to scandal of mining and then pollution, Chinese companies are not the only ones, because historically also had some Western company being responsible of that. But in terms of trend, that could be the main trend. But we also have large investment, large producing. And one of the element that we also see is the connection between mining investment, infrastructure related investment, or to those mining projects, and the nexus between mining projects and electrification projects in certain countries that we also see taking place in various countries.
Great, thank you for that. Emmanuel, turning to you, as global demand for green minerals accelerates, what questions are you particularly concerned about when it comes to the critical mineral supply chain? What would you like to see happen, and what kinds of impacts are communities seeing today?
Yeah, thank you, Connie, for having us on this conversation. And I will just to start by adding a bit of context so people can understand why today Chinese companies are dominating in Africa, where those critical minerals. But also, if you try to see the influence of China, where China is, where you can find many Chinese companies, I mean, it's a small portion if you compare to other countries investing in Africa. So we don't talk about that, but people are more focused on just China. And if you try to see, you can count those countries which own those critical minerals. So you can count them and say how many countries where China has really a huge influence. And that one too. So how Chinese came to control this critical sector. I mean, I can give the case of DRC, where from 2002 to 2007, I can say all mining were owned by Western companies. All of them. And how now we have Chinese companies, more of Chinese, they are controlling like 80% of production of copper and cobalt in Congo. That's the truth. But how? It's from that period, from 2007 to 2015, we saw that those Western companies, they sold their share to Chinese companies without any consultation from the Congolese government at that time. And if you see in the revised mining code, Congolese revised mining code, we added a provision where we are trying to say, if you have the share in DRC, if you need to sell it, then you need to consult the Congolese government. That's the idea we added, because now the question is why we have more Chinese companies in Congo. And those Western companies, they got big money when they left. You know, you got something for free, and then you sell it to someone who can give you billions, and then you leave the country. But also, it's why they did that. One, it's because NGOs like AfriWatch, but other international NGOs, they were making noise, asking them to be more transparent, asking them to respect human rights. So they said, okay, we can't play with Chinese in the same space. But never understand that argument, because they were not Chinese. So they were saying, yeah, we can't play with them because we don't play on the same rules. They were not Chinese, so they sold them their shares. So, and now we have Chinese. They are controlling a big portion. I can say big because I said 80%. So it's huge. It gives them a lot of power. But also at the same time, it's because the people, they knew that at the end of the day, those minerals, they will not be just used in China. They are just going to transit from China, and then China will send them, of course, to Europe, to the US. And then we will keep blaming China. I think that was the idea for me as Africans. So we need to leave because, you know, when you look at the value chain of those critical minerals, where people are making big money, it's not at the mine level. It's not at the mine level. So that job, we can leave it for China. And then we can just control where we are making billions and billions. That's the truth. So now it happened that, and that time there was not conflict between China and the US. So now there is a conflict, open conflicts. So US is trying to challenge China and trying to get back and try to see how they can secure minerals from Africa, and especially from DRC. I think that's why the debate is coming on the table. And Gerard was talking about the deal between China, the deal between DRC and the US. You have Qatar has signed another deal with DRC, 21 billion. So people are trying to see how they can get their portion. So in terms of production, now DRC is producing like around 3 million tons of copper, more than 200,000 tons of cobalt, and you have tins and casterite. So you have those minerals, and soon they start producing lithium in Manono, and we have a huge deposit to compare to other countries. Today, we talk about Zimbabwe because they are producing, but now in coming days, maybe in 1 year, DRC will start producing lithium. Now they produce zinc. So you see, so you have those minerals. So, and even in the lithium, if you see, there were an Australian companies which sold shares to Chinese companies. So you have that situation where people are just selling and then they are blaming others. So what, in terms of problems, yes, we have a lot of problems. in terms of what the impact. So if you try to see in terms of production, that huge production comes with a lot of problems. You have problems of pollution, for instance. So it's a huge problem how you control that pollution. 2, you have the question of community displacements. So you need to remove population so you can mine from where, because if you find a big reserve of mining, then you need to push. And then there is a problem of how you compensate those communities. And you have also the other problems in terms of sometimes you need to bribe to get those licenses. And even up to now, you can see how the US is dealing. There's not any, we don't know how those contracts, because you have the contract which says the first rights should be given to the US companies. So it means you don't need to compete, or you don't need to do tender so people can compete. So you need just to give for the US companies. So that's another problem of transparency, of corruption sometimes, but also the question of power. It's a question of power. So what the US is trying to use now is a question of power. But also there is so I can stop there. I think these minerals should be, I never agree with people who are saying that to have a minerals, it's a case. No, it's a false theory. It's not a case. It's question of management. It's question of transparency, but it's question of sharing profits. We talk more about problems, but we don't talk about how we share profits. That's the question. And I was saying, when you look at value chain addition, you will see that you are not making a lot of money where you are at the mine level. So we need to discuss with big companies in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere, how can we share profit? And to end, the question of energy transition, because that's the topic we are talking. If you go to Kolwezi, you can't see an electronic vehicle. If you go to Kolwezi, so how can we talk about energy transition where people who own those minerals, they can't even afford a car? This is a problem for us as a Congolese. So can we discuss about that? So yes, I can stop from there and then, yeah.
Thank you. And I asked a lot of questions in one. And so what I hope to do, I'm going to turn to Georges now, but what I'd like to do is come back and talk about the value chain in a little bit and get a better sense of, what you would like to see in terms of changes with that. So turning back to you, I'd like to pick up the thread about governance, Georges.
Yes.
So this demand intensifies. You've emphasized a lot that African governments must set the terms of engagement rather than simply respond to the external pressures that they're getting. So from your standpoint, what are the practical guardrails, whether at a more local level or on a global level, that are necessary to prevent this new scramble? Maybe it's too late to. I'd be curious to get your perspective on that. But to prevent a really new scramble for African resources under this green label, and to really ensure that the demand leads to long-term development on the continent.
The basic guardrail to avoid that scramble to take place is just to have, first of all, political stability and basic good governance in many of those countries. The issue that we do have in those countries, the fact that I'm going to take an example of two countries, Zimbabwe and the DRC. Those countries are rich, and even Guinea as well. Those countries are rich in natural resources, as we've mentioned. But when you do have political instability, and that leads to regime insecurity and regime change that can happen anytime soon, you see a regime in place considering natural resources and critical minerals in this case as bargaining tool, bargaining chip for their own regime security, ready to sign any forms of kind of deal that's going to allow them to garner political support, external political support and internal political support. I'm mentioning that because we have to pay attention between the decision we take on the policy that we put in place for the country and the policy that we took in place that are driven by regime security and regime survival mode from those countries. And many of those countries, because they do not have good political system and they do not have political stability, the policy they put in place when it comes to the mining industry are most of the time driven by how those policy will serve the regime that are in power. And which is, for me, is one of the big hindrance when it comes to talk about avoiding those scrambles. Earlier, I've mentioned the case of the DRC-US deal that's signed. This is a perfect example of a scramble taking place because you have a regime in Kinshasa that's trying to survive against external rebellion pushed by Rwanda and all of that. So in this context, you cannot have good policy put in place in terms of long-term development, long-term industrialization, because the one who's designing those policy are thinking about how am I going to survive in the next 5 to 10 years? And this is the issue. And for me, this is the basic, very basic foundation in terms of guardrail to put in place to allow us to start designing long-term industrial policy that makes sense, that do not just take into account what the current regime would think about its own survival. And for me, this is the basic one. Without having those basic elements on the table, it's going to be hard to really have long-term conversation. Another example would be South Africa. South Africa has a different case. Because of South Africa has a different past and different case, much more stability, you can see the mining industry in South Africa thriving and being developed differently. Whether the president changing in South Africa, the mining industry keeps on moving forward. The policy that's put in place are still moving forward. But when you go to countries, as I've mentioned before, the DRC, the Zimbabwe, you still have the sense like, if the regime changes today, what would happen to all those policies that we've put in place, to all these agreements we've signed before? And this, as I said earlier, I don't want to take long. This, for me, is the basic guardrail to avoid those kind of scramble to take place. Because without those guardrails in terms of good governance, in terms of political stability, government will never be able to think of what should be a good long-term policy beyond our own survival as government.
But so how do you put those guardrails in place if it needs to be? It's almost like the government that doesn't have any real
incentive, yes,
to regulate itself. Why is it going to put up these guardrails? And so how do you get from that point where, if you need good governance for the guardrails, how do you get to the point where that can be put in place? What needs to happen?
That's a very tough question to answer. This is the space where you're gonna have my friend here, Emmanuel Mpula from civil society, playing a role of really trying as much as possible to warn people of the policy that we need to put in place, to really be those voices, to carry the voices of people beyond government, beyond regime change, that what needs to be done on the ground. And of course, in the context of political instability, even civil society ability are limited. Even the ability to make real long-term change are limited. People would believe that maybe a regional approach that integrates different stakeholders to a long-term vision and to a regional long-term industrial policy can be a solution for that. But even when you think of that, you realize that internal political economy of each African country, for each producers, are playing in the way that how they do approach, how they interact with those regional integration mechanisms. I'm going to give you an example. The DRC and Zambia a few years ago signed a bilateral agreement to develop, a regional value chain for EV batteries on the ground. Up till now, nothing have seen any kind of tangible progress. Why? Because on both sides of the border, they're thinking about, what am I gaining out of this? Why, in the DRC side, why am I going to agree to let my minerals leaving the DRC to be processed in Zambia, where I'm the one producing it more? In Zambia, it's the same thing. Why am I going to let my copper go to DRC, where we have much more political stability, we have better infrastructure, we have better roads, we have better electricity and all of that. So you have all those issues which are really playing at the national level, which makes at the end regional solution difficult to implement, even when and if we have really good policy. We have now the African Green Mineral Vision that have been adopted by the AU, but still to see that being implemented, we're gonna have to see countries to be willing to give up a portion of their sovereignty to a larger supranational entity to say, we're going to trust you to help us devise and design policy that's really going to help us to move forward. But so far, we haven't seen that because there's no really strong demand internally from each producing countries to give up on those advantages. Because, as I said earlier, natural resources are used as political asset for many regimes in terms of political survival.
Thank you. Emmanuel, I'd love for you to comment on that. And then just for those of you listening, I will get to audience questions shortly. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. So Emmanuel, on the governance issue and what Jorge just said about keeping, that these resources are, part of the political legitimacy of the governments and tying that back to the supply chains and profits. How does the governance interact with the profit sharing the value chain and how do you think the value chain could be improved? And is there a way that, both of these things can come together in terms of governance and, more equitable distribution of profits?
That's a good question. Thank you so much for that question, which is very good. I mean, it's a question of discussing with big companies. I know there's a question of jobs. There's a question of profit. But there will not be energy transition if we don't take care of people who are really depending on those minerals. And afterwards, for instance, we are talking to those automakers in the US to try to define what is the value chain, how it works, to understand first. We need to understand how it works. That one. Two, we need to define because now the system is like you are taking raw materials out of Africa. So we need to make sure that before those minerals leave the continent, we need to add value to some point. So that question of discussion with those companies. I know the question sometimes they say there is instability, the question of energy. There's some reasons where people are saying it's not possible to do that here. In my mind, I can say it's possible. It's a question of interest. Because now, what is the difference between taking minerals to China, transform them, and then taking them to Europe or to the US or to Canada? So there's not a difference. So, I mean, we need, as I said, it's a question of discussing, and then we need to discuss with automakers, to discuss with other countries, like even China. I can say Chinese companies will come. If Western, they are just taking time, so in some point, Chinese can say, okay, instead of taking all minerals out of the continent, then we can come and install our companies so we can refine. Then I'm sure that Western will be late. They will react. Yeah, so this is the good time to discuss with African, with Congolese, especially in the deal with the DRC and the US. I think they should sit and discuss more openly with a clear plan, project, that one, but also the question of discussion on the continent level, how collaboration between Zambia, DRC can help, for instance, to build something which will be robust and which will help to add value at the continent level. But also we can see in many countries, Guinea, how Guinea, Madagascar, Congo, Zambia, and Zimbabwe can collaborate in a project. So yeah, that's for me the way I see we can add value. And by adding value in the continent, that will allow us first to improve skills, secondly, to get more money from those minerals.
Do you see willingness on the part of certain governments in Africa to either work collaboratively in order to bring more value or keep more value within the continent? Or do you see governments working with the companies to try to keep value in country? Is that something that you're seeing? And if so, where?
I mean, there is. The Zambia and DRC, they are talking how to develop their center, a battery center where they need to produce batteries. I don't know. They are discussing, but it's the idea which is on the table. So we, as Airforwatch, we are pushing them to move forward. And there is a collaboration, like even when we talk about Lobito Corridor, which is another corridor where US is trying to get mineral to challenge Chinese. And then we can see Angola, DRC, they are trying to see how they can collaborate. But I think we need to do more, But this needs stability, We need stability in those countries. But also we need to make sure that we can separate business and politics. So, I mean, sometimes we are using both of them. I understand that, but it means if we keep doing the same thing, that means we are undermining the potential we have. And so for me, there is a possibility. And even when you talk with automakers, I think they are trying to understand what is going on. And so we need to convince them to make sure that they can come, they can invest, and they should get more security and for their investment. Yeah.
So just to wrap it up, I'm going to give a question to each of you, and I'll start with you, Geoffroy, because it seems like for you, the main issue is governance. And so the question I'd like to ask each of you is sort of like, what is the one thing that you would want to see happen, pretty specifically, because I know governance is really, I think, a big issue, but, whether it's in the DRC, whether it's in, any particular country, to kind of help move this forward and indicate that you're headed in the right direction. And then Emmanuel, I'm interested in the same question for you, but for the value chain.
Oof, that's a very tough question. But one of the things specifically I would like to see, one of the change I would like to see in terms of mining rights and legislation in Africa is going to be to remove the first come, first serve system, the mining right. Because in the case of the DRC, the mining permits are given to the first come, first right, first come and first serve. You come for it, it's available, you come and they give it to you. I think we should be moving toward a bidding tender system where mining companies are coming and they're proposing the best mining proposal, the best ideas, the best mining project that are going to meet the local demand, the whole plan that we've put in place. And then from there, we can choose which one is better. And in that regard, doing that, all parties involved will know their obligation and the expectation, because you made your case based on a certain premise, a certain set of premises and condition, fiscal condition, governance condition, all of that. And the government chose you knowing that the plan you made, they were based on those sets of conditions. So basically, we create a stability clause de facto in a way that once we choose you, we know that you as a mining company, you know that in the next 15, 20 years, my operation will be running smoothly because those are the conditions I applied my mining rights to, my project was based on. And the government also knows in terms of expectation, the revenues and what you're going to produce, what kind of job are going to create, what kind of industry you're going to build on the ground. Those, I think, would be, for me, in terms of a good direction to take, a change I would like to see in the mining legislation in many countries, to remove the first come, first serve system, to really go on a tender bidding system where the best who propose the best idea, the best business proposal, and the best plan on the ground wins the mining permits and the mining rights.
It's more proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's good. And Emmanuel, because you seem to be very focused on the value chain, at least right now, what's the one thing you'd love to see happen?
I mean, I can talk about infrastructures. We need to build infrastructures. We need to build first, we need energy. That one. So 2, we need to build road or railway so we can connect. And that will help people to say, okay, if we invest in terms of refining or adding value, we can easily evacuate those from the continent. So we need to make sure that we have that. But the second one is to improve skills in Africa and especially in DRC. So we need to invest. We are talking about education. So it's key. see if we need to. The third one is to have a long-term vision, because between partners, they need to have a long and clear vision. You can take the agreement between US and DRC. So we need to see if the US need really to come back. They need to have a clear vision, not a short-term vision, but a clear vision and long-term vision, which can help those countries to work together, to be honest in what they are doing, and most importantly, stability, peace.
Well, thank you both. This has been a fascinating discussion. I hope someone who is can make these decisions is listening, so that they can implement your excellent ideas. So thank you both for joining Network 2020 today. Thank you everyone who is listening, and especially thank you for your excellent insights today.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.